Now you may recall, a short while ago, I decided to throw in a curveball with no particular starting point, considering the topic of human survival in terms of a total civilization collapse or otherwise global apocalypse. Most of the time, when I ask people what they want me to cover on this channel, the answer is obviously 40k, which is very obvious and fair, and that isn't changing either. But periodically, I think it is beneficial to have some kind of palate cleanser, and also now and then on YouTube, testing adjacent ground matters. And the comment I see most often is from the percentage of you who say that you'd happily listen to me read basically anything, which is very nice, but I also wonder just how true that is. Now, my last piece discussing the apocalypse was quite recent, just a mere 4 years ago, yet comically I still get people commenting every month, not just on that video, but on totally unrelated posts and other content, asking when am I going to make the next installment. So fair enough, if people are still asking me 4 years later, according to my past self, because it's so long ago I can't remember, my original aim was to create, quote, a series exploring post-apocalyptic fiction and the wider ideas behind societal collapse. I think past me was being a little bit over-optimistic, because while that sounds good in theory, as always, it's your engagement with this video which will determine just how expansive a series I can go forward to make. So I guess if you agree and want me to take this idea further, make sure you absolutely hit the like and leave a comment. Tell me what apocalypse scenario or media you would want me to discuss next. It can be as niche or as mainstream as you want, and if I don't know about it already, I can research and learn. Now, just to try and tie things together, I will open noting that there continues to be this bleak fascination with inhuman horror, and that absolutely runs deep through 40k. The grim darkness, the despair, the sense of absolute futility. It's not just about atrocity, it's about the sense that in the Imperium, you may survive, but then what? What is the point of living if all you're doing is serving like a component within a machine? Well, in the Imperium, you are of course living to serve the Emperor, and apparently this is supposed to be enough to rationalize your sacrifice. It's really well addressed in one of the most recent 40k novels, Apostle, which I posted about the other day saying this sounds like it's going to be a banger. It is, because it really deals with the fundamental concepts of what is the imperial religion, what it means to humans, and how easily it can be for them to stray off the path. It highlights how humans really are living for nothing more than service to the Emperor now, or just to the Ministorum. They work to eat and live. They live to work. And that cycle just continues. It's horrifying, and it demonstrates the weakness of the system. And one of the characters encounters somebody she once knew in this exact cycle situation, and she's absolutely appalled. She even confronts him about the apparent meaningless and futility to their situation, upon which he becomes very agitated and is unwilling to just face the grim reality of his situation. Plus, of course, the overarching theme is about the Emperor and humans facing the prospect that their lives are just wasted, and that really he will never protect them. So Apostle I highly recommend, but that of course is 40k. It has its own framing and context, which of course does not apply to more realistic scenarios here in our own world now. Because if we're talking then about fictional or even non-fictional human societal collapse, this to me feels like a natural extension, and it's why I think this series really became a natural tangent evolution out of 40k. And I noted this as much in the first Apocalypse video, that I think what triggered me wanting to talk about this more were responses that I got from many of you when discussing that Resource Worlds video in 40k. And I threw into that video, the first Resource Worlds video, a few real world tangents highlighting how society can deteriorate very quickly when resources are sparse, and how that relates to 40k, and how Imperial worlds could collapse back in upon themselves very easily. And in that last video of Apocalypse, we also explored events like the Bronze Age collapse and its relevancy there, the general idea that the more advanced a civilization becomes, the more naturally specialized and compartmentalized it becomes, and that while that specialization creates efficiency, it also can create severe fragility. And this is a theme that I've returned to several times, connected to various fictional narratives, because as we know, modern societies depend on these small clusters of highly trained people. It's just a concept which is really fascinating to me, because most people in our everyday lives just never ever think about it, because we don't need to, and that's totally understandable. But when you start to really think about this small amount of people essentially keeping everything working, it's quite terrifying, because this small percentage of a population will operate and service complex logistics. They'll be performing work on invisible but essential systems, and modern tech-heavy societies really depend entirely on these kind of systems that are operated by this small, specialized minority. The proportion of people directly running the most critical infrastructure, like for example nuclear plants, national grid control, communication networks, major data centers, air traffic systems, hospital critical care, that can typically be very easily under 2% of the total workforce, often closer to 1% or even less. Now, admittedly, there are areas which are equally vital but require less high specialization, like general logistics. No matter what, you're going to need to move things around. That has to happen. But without power and key communications which sort of overarch that, a lot of those things are still going to break down almost instantly. Stability disintegrates. We talked about this last time, where once you sort of stop having the ability to deliver fuel properly, that is going to impact everything else. It has this knock-on, spiraling cascade effect. And so no matter what, it always ties back to this small 1 and 2% of people, where if they are not there doing what they need to do, and nobody else really understands what they do, once those people are gone, you've got a major problem. And so to me, this concept is a really fascinating one. It's the kind of thing you would sit up all night thinking about, because it's this idea, this precariousness that constitutes a piece of what makes post-apocalyptic fiction very compelling, because most people can understand that we live inside this impossible, intricate logistical structure. And although most of the time it might stumble now and then, get a little broken from time to time, mostly it works, and works beautifully because it has to. Until, of course, it doesn't. The real question should be how many pillars, how big of a pillar, can fall before the structure of civilization itself begins to crack, and whether what follows is extinction, stagnation, regression, collapse, or some other transformation. And what does that look like? Very often, apocalypse scenarios or narratives can be very over the top and sensational. That's typical for movies and television. It's obvious because they do it to create that visceral reaction. It's part of the genre. And while there are certainly an element of an audience who really look for that, I think it's more about the atmosphere and imagining, could you survive in that similar situation, and how would you do so? What decisions would you make? It's why when it comes to most media that's apocalypse based, I really enjoy the earlier stages of deterioration, where people are trying to get out of their city, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do before things absolutely break down. And the reason I usually enjoy that kind of establishing exposition is because most of the time in TV and media shows about apocalypse, very soon after we've established that things are going bad, suddenly people are walking around with face paint on, they're wearing cut-up tires, they've got pet tigers, there's a dark secret hidden out of sight, until too late, shock plot twist, and some other rubbish like this. I find this kind of thing to be incredibly trite, to the point that it's exhausting, and very often with apocalypse shows, I tend to not really watch them. I will scan through them and pick out elements where I'm like, that's an interesting idea, that's an interesting idea. Other than that, I don't really care at all what's happening. A good example, in the past I've referenced the well-known disaster in The Walking Dead. And when I say disaster, I don't mean in the world, I mean in terms of the show itself, where a key beloved character was killed very brutally. If you've watched it, you know, it was a spectacular L for the producers of the show, because they thought they were giving the audience what they wanted: maximum gore, trauma, watch a character go down. They entirely misunderstood the assignment. It cost them severely in terms of their audience. It was also coupled with an incredibly annoying episodic story release structure, contributed to them then hemorrhaging viewership, where people just said, I've had enough, I'm done, from that point onward. Anyway, the point is though simply that while in apocalypse narratives generally, it is often necessary to illustrate the brutal reality of life and what people can be pushed to do, that can be accomplished in ways which are far more subtle and well written, and not so necessarily graphic and kind of lazy. It's really important to understand that to tell a successful grounded story, you need to have at least some actual anchor points to things which are believable and grounded. Because if a character has to be killed, do it in a way that is justified and also pay some respect to them, because your audience will expect that. Unless you're making anything close to, of course, an actual more documentary series, and then circumstances are going to dictate what happens more than anything else, no matter how much a character is well liked. And what drives most people's interest in the downfall of civilization is just plain curiosity, the allure of collapse. There's a strange draw in imagining a full reset of everything, and for some the thought of such a reset is perhaps even preferable to our current world. Plus, there is this historical memory within all of us that in our ancient history, or even more recently, empires and civilizations do fall. Yet whatever most could imagine, this would undoubtedly never match the actual raw reality. In more recent times, I think there also is an inherent understanding of what this could mean for us. Because as a global population, humans have now been more recently ever touched by the likes of pandemic, natural disasters, shortages, so it's not too far of a step for people to begin wondering what happens when deliveries stop turning up. What happens when utilities break down, when stores begin rationing, heated disruptions break out, news cycles and communications become disrupted or cease entirely, the internet stops functioning. Now the constant background hum of global affairs and something of a safety net that you know what's going on just disappears. You feel isolated and alone. No one has any answers. The supermarkets are being looted. Should you go and do that too? You don't want to miss out. If everybody's doing it, it must be okay. But then what? It depends on what caused the breakdown. And as we see sadly with increasing regularity, war leaves a deep scar which can only heal with time, but it usually comes at a great loss. A pandemic is another matter entirely, and by any metric, the most recent that we faced could have been far, far worse in terms of mortality. An acute or slow environmental collapse is a different thing again, and is it localized to one country or more broadly across a continent? If there are deaths, how many? How is that being handled? One of the most critical factors which will determine what sort of apocalyptic scenario is always how many people are left to deal with what comes after. Then it's also down to communication. Can you still call somebody on the other side of the country? Can you even get there? Are you allowed to travel? And that might sound silly, but in a true disaster, it's more than plausible that regular travel could be very heavily restricted to allow essential services to do what they need to do. And while smaller local roads may be very numerous, it's those major arterial networks which really connect everything, and those can be easily controlled with checkpoints, while smaller access points which people might try and use to get around the problem would be very much shut down. You might just find it impossible to travel. In terms of communication, it's actually very critical for a government to be able to just tell other people around the country what they need to do. You want to have some kind of centralized authority who's going to be planning everything out. Now, often local authorities will have a playbook for what they should do if communication is not possible and they're able to operate independently, but that usually rests on the idea that at some point things will get connected back up. So the question becomes, what happens when that doesn't occur? The point is, there are many factors which feed into what the shape of the world looks like after some major event, because as life continues on, it would only be further refined and defined by those details. The first few weeks would never tell the whole story anyway, because devastating as whatever event may be, shock and awe will wear off. People survive, people adapt. But in terms of an apocalypse, what if instead of just flu-like symptoms which most people recover from, the infection or plague faced was more horrific, more lethal? In some scenarios, what felt like the end starts to become that incredibly tedious phrase of new normal. In other scenarios, what seemed like the end is in fact only the beginning. And this is why apocalyptic scenarios pull people in, because they allow you to quietly run that simulation in the safety of your own mind, perhaps present you with details and questions that you had not considered. because I think the visual evidence and the stories we see tend to point to the fact that the vast majority of citizens are not set up or prepared or just have the knowledge to cope on their own. So one of the shows I promised to talk about more is Survivors, specifically the first iteration from way back in 1975. And in a demonstration of the archival value of YouTube, I originally came across Survivors many years ago, late one night when I'd been considering in frustration how few apocalyptic movies or dramas existed which specifically did not feature the tired tropes as we just discussed, which I find so incredibly tedious, which see human survivors in a literal battle for their very survival, yet simultaneously and inexplicably try to constantly murder each other over the most implausibly bizarre scenarios, pointless struggles, a love interest, just plain ego, or any number of other oddball, spurious scenarios. So finding at 3 AM a gem like Survivors, I was instantly hooked, and as I recall, proceeded to binge the low-quality 360p version of the entire series that same night. The premise is fairly straightforward. A virus escapes a lab and proceeds to spread globally in a matter of days. Its impact is very literally apocalyptic. The survival rate is suggested at being anything like 1 in 5,000. Effectively, the world sees a depopulation of anything like 99%, returning Earth to a time more akin to 2500 BC in terms of population. The question is then, could we survive? Well, humans have suffered similar extreme depopulations in the past, the most extreme being in 70,000 BC, when it's estimated that humans dropped to as low as 1,000 individuals globally. This has been determined from genomic studies and aligns with an extreme volcanic event on Earth at that time, and I probably should save and expand upon that yet in another video. But Survivors quite efficiently depicts this terrifyingly rapid decimation of the population in the UK, so that within essentially the first half of episode 1, the vast majority of the UK population are dead, leaving only a wafer-thin percentage of survivors. The virus itself is an extremely virulent flu-like virus with a near total mortality rate. It makes people seem sick with moderate symptoms. They don't appear critical at first, but the infection itself seems resistant to the body's immune system or any drug treatments. And then in just a few days, it will kill everybody who has contracted this. So a wildfire of pandemic burns through the country and the world, and the key factor in the show as to how this occurs is that seemingly the incubation period is such that by the time anybody became aware of its severity, it has already spread globally, basically about a week. And as symptoms appear so mild at first, this also meant it was spread within nations very quickly. And of course, remembering that we're back in the 1970s here, so technology is not as advanced as it were today. They wouldn't be using heat technology or checking people's temperature as they're moving around, but quite honestly, I don't know whether that really would have made any difference. And one early criticism within this show is, for me, there appears to be little, if any, effort to really curb the spread of the virus, but maybe that's because by the time they did so, everybody who existed to implement it is dead. And there is some reference to that later on as well, because to be fair, this likely is what happened due to the events being presented in such a fashion that as soon as anybody became suspective of what was occurring, it was already too late. And again, I think this is due to the fact also that the series itself is set in the 70s, and so obviously national communication is nothing like we have now. What I mean is basically for most people it's going to be radio and a little bit of television. You don't have the internet access and wireless mobile access wherever you are. And so quickly we end up following the few who survived or had the sense to flee cities into the countryside to put space between themselves and others as fast as possible. They do attempt to explain this indirectly as well. We see several survivors who appear healthy and then unintentionally infect others. And so at least in this first week or so, it still appears that those who were not naturally immune could still contract and die from the virus, which perhaps is suggestive of its persistence and that maybe those who did survive are effectively permanent carriers. Anyway, that's the premise. Initially in Survivors, we begin by following several different characters. Most notable is one woman, Abby Grant, looking for her son, and through the lens of her perspective, we learn more about the events as they unraveled and just what has happened. I think I've mentioned it before, but be under no illusion as to just how much of a slow burn Survivors is as a show. Because when I say slow, I mean it is slow. It's more about people making decisions than action. And while there are confrontations, you can forget about gunfights or really fights beyond a scuffle, which I think some would argue is quite a lot more plausible, but I think they could have occasionally upped the ante a little bit more. I guess in some respects it's similar to Talking Dead in that regard, if their conversations were actually realistic and they didn't just throw their plans out the window the second anything happened. Thinking about it, actually, in Survivors there are a few gun battles, but it's nothing like what you would imagine in something more contemporary. What works well with Survivors is that in a situation like this, where there's a rapid collapse of a population, they are so focused purely on their immediate survival and what challenges they might face in the years to come, you don't suddenly see some bizarre, grandiose groups becoming hyper-violent. Because what it shows is that humans will always group together and gravitate towards organising into small communities. And then later, as has always been the case, you might find areas having disputes and so on. But given people wouldn't necessarily be thrown into a world, as I've said, that's akin to Mad Max on day one, it would be fair to assume that generally there would be an understanding that it was in the best interests of most to work together, to a degree anyway. And again, this is addressed in the first episode. Because undoubtedly, and in this series, you do see the emergence of bandits who have a different view about how things should be ongoing, those who even will prey on others and exploit their successes. It seems fairly reasonable to assume that most others, the majority, would be attempting to forge something of a better civilization for themselves. And Survivors was such a slow burn show that it did not attempt to significantly tackle concepts of what other survivors were doing beyond our little band of soap opera farmers. There are a couple of episodes where we do see other communities, but these aren't especially fleshed out. The lack of budget clearly restricted the possibility of such deeper explorations, which is a big shame. But I dare not complain when given such an isolated, true example of civilization breakdown. For while Survivors was very much of its time crafted in an era where the strange juxtaposition of wacky science fiction was twixt with bleak narratives, poignant messages, or questions which remained in the mind of an audience, I for one cherish this era of storytelling: Silent Running, The Andromeda Strain, Logan's Run, No Blade of Grass, Westworld, Planet of the Apes, which admittedly is in 68, Dawn of the Dead, Mad Max, also 79, Clockwork Orange, Coma, Solaris, Soylent Green. Many of these laid the groundwork for some truly seminal narratives that would be produced then in the 80s. But to talk more about Survivors, I want to intro for you the first episode, and then also briefly talk about some other specific moments and events they face within later episodes. I guess I will also just say spoilers, as I'm sure some of you might want to check this series out. On the other hand, it's a show which is 50 years old now, so kind of whatever. So Survivors begins with this key character, Abby Grant. She's a housewife in her family home just outside London. She's talking with the housekeeper, who is observing how she's having difficulty reaching family members through the regular phone lines. So even in that first 60 seconds as we enter the show, it's clear something isn't quite right, and already communications and logistics are breaking down. This is the sort of thing that I love about apocalypse drama, the sense that the edges of normality are beginning to fray. People are aware something is going on, but at first they don't want to believe it. They presume it's nothing too much to worry about. We follow their decisions as they go deeper into realizing that the situation is more serious. As Abby heads out to take her housekeeper to the station, they drive past the local doctor, who asks if he can give them a shot of flu vaccine later in the day. Abby appears quite nonchalant, but the doctor has an air of anxiety about him. So it's clear that the flu-like virus is already in the public conversation, and it's clear he knows more than he's telling. At the station, the timetable is now non-existent, and drivers are seemingly all off sick. The station is basically deserted. Then we encounter a different character, Jenny. Her roommate is very seriously unwell and suffering the typical severe flu-like symptoms. Meanwhile, Abby's husband finally turns up late at the station, but now it is night. It's taken him such a significant effort to get back here, while many others were clearly unable to travel at all. So at this point, it's apparent that in a very short space of time, the standard transport infrastructure has effectively collapsed, meaning a lot of people can no longer move around. In the city, we're then back with Jenny, and it's already bedlam. The streets are gridlocked with cars, and the hospitals are being overwhelmed. She's gone to the hospital to seek help for her roommate, and she meets a doctor friend there, junior doctor or whatever. He gives her a rundown of things and basically states that they're now just turning people flat away from hospitals. It's critically understaffed because the doctors and other staff are also as sick as the public, and that things are taking basically a sharp left turn. Jenny starts asking, well, how long does this virus last? What she's talking about is more in terms of your standard seasonal illness, where somebody has a period of very strong symptoms and then recovers. The doctor cuts her off and explains this is not flu, and she's somewhat taken aback. He goes on to explain that the vaccines they're just giving to everybody might as well be water. They're basically just doing it to reduce panic, because they've already seen 70 deaths that day. He notes they expect that to be 2 or even 3 times more by the morning. Critically, he also says it takes about 6 days for the incubation of the infection, then you get the symptoms and death, which gives us a clear indicator of how widespread the virus likely is. 6 days is a lot of time for something to be spread around, and likely why it has already reached now a point that it is overwhelming hospitals, and likely also why the government later on basically disintegrates along with the majority of the population. It was just too widespread before it could even hope to be contained. Now Abby is back with her husband, and they're having a kind of relaxed evening. He's also noting how there were barely any offices in London with a full staff. He speculates that it seems too severe to be the flu, but they don't really talk about it more. Suddenly their power goes out. Jenny now returns to her flat, with her doctor friend apparently returning with her. They find the roommate dead in her absence. Things are now getting very serious. The doctor tells Jenny she needs to get out of the city immediately and into the countryside. She argues with him about this, but he impresses upon her just how severe things are. He talks about how some people might have a natural immunity and that she might be one of those people because she hasn't shown any symptoms. He also tells her she needs to get out now because this thing is accelerating and soon likely they won't even be able to dispose of the dead, and that will bring all manner of other more complex issues like cholera and typhoid into the mix. She still seems really unable to comprehend the scale of what's happening, but he continues to note that with the speed the virus is hitting, soon the dead are going to outnumber the living, and that of all the patients at the hospital, only a single person so far had survived. Back now with Abby, and she is showing symptoms of the virus, but her and her husband are of course totally unaware of how serious this is, so they head to bed. Jenny is now attempting to get out of the city. She has a small encounter with a couple of guys who give her some hassle, but she does manage to run away. But just from that encounter, it's pretty clear that there's a sense that law and order is already deteriorating. Those guys were out there looting, and people are becoming very aware of that fact already. Abby is now up in the night. She's burning up, and in desperation, her husband goes out, hoping to find the doctor. By luck, he does. But the doctor notes his wife died today, and that the virus seems unstoppable. He states he's already seen 17 dead in their village, including a whole family within an hour of each other. He doesn't want to say any more, but it's clear he's fearing the worst. He speculates that within a week, millions will likely be dead. Jenny finds an abandoned car to sleep in the middle of some woodland, and Abby is now still in bed suffering. We see from her alarm clock that Abby remains unconscious for 3 days straight. She then awakens to find her husband is not with her. She comes downstairs to find the house in a bit of a state. Food is moulding on the kitchen table, and she discovers her husband in the living room. He's dead. Jenny, meanwhile, who has seemingly been wandering, finds a strange man in a tent who seems similarly intent on staying away from others as much as possible to avoid the virus. He seems a bit of a poacher, really. He reminds her to also stay away from others. Abby wanders around her village looking for survivors, but she finds none, and in each house or car there are only dead people. She visits the church, and it's full of the dead. She realises, surprisingly late, that her son is at boarding school still, and she needs to get there immediately. So Jenny now hears a car roaring along a road nearby. She rushes to try and intercept, but misses it, and that driver is Abby. So she arrives at the boarding school and finds some of the boys dead in their dormitory. But her son's bed is empty. Before leaving, she sees a light on and goes to investigate, and inside she finds a professor lying on the desk, seemingly dead, except to her great shock, he isn't. He's just hard of hearing and was asleep. He explains to her about her son, and that in the school they tried to head off and camp outside the boys who were basically not showing any particular symptoms, so they find a place to isolate themselves. He then tells her that for those who remained here, none survived. 300 dead. But what follows is one of my favourite moments in the whole series. I've mentioned it in the past in 40k videos, but here the professor is talking about how he heard over a radio the last communications through official channels, that a state of emergency was declared, but this was all but pointless as so few police and others were left alive to really implement this. And then some sort of emergency administration tried to take control, but by the time this was set up, it seemingly also went silent. Likely, they all died too. So we get the sense that official mechanisms tried to cope but were just overwhelmed, and due to the extreme lethality of the virus, any normal planning was all but irrelevant and impossible to realistically implement. So Abby asks him, what's going to happen? And here, he makes something of a declaration to Abby. He describes how the aftermath of this time is the real horror, and that those who can survive through what is yet to come will be the true survivors. She seems taken aback by the severity he's trying to present the tone with, noting that the resources that are available now must be incredibly significant for how few people have survived, and he corrects her that yes, that's true, but only for a few years, because after this people will need to learn how to produce what they need once more, and that is the real ticking clock. It is an amazing, if not fairly clear observation, where he then lays out the complexity about how objects we take for granted. His argument is that while books exist, certainly, actually finding and producing and crafting all the elements of any given object is unbelievably complicated, be it a pencil, a candle, a light bulb. Could you go and find those things and know how to refine and fabricate them? He gives the example that a carpenter doesn't necessarily cut down trees himself, nor does he make the tools he uses. Woodworking, like stonemasonry or anything in the skilled trades, is a highly specialized discipline that people take a lifetime to learn. The more you then start to unpack this, you begin to realize that even in ancient human history, they were already dealing with very highly specialized roles, because that's what was needed, and they had the capability and the structure to produce that kind of work. But getting to that point is incredibly complicated, and this is something which is very rarely, if ever, addressed in the majority of apocalypse scenarios, which drives me absolutely crazy. And then this brings him to his devastating conclusion, that in some ways, if people do not grasp this concept and begin to learn quickly the essential skills for the future, then humans will at some point be thrown back into not just the Dark or the Bronze Ages, but potentially even the Stone Age in terms of knowledge. Which sounds extreme and unbelievable, but I think in many ways this is spot on. In a scenario such as Survivors, nobody is selecting who survives. There's a high probability that just by chance, a good amount of people would be pretty unskilled and lack any really constructive knowledge. It's difficult enough to learn a highly specialized trade by working with and alongside those who can teach you, but trying to learn without that, essentially self-taught, that is extraordinarily difficult. And even by chance, if you manage to luck upon a few people in your settlement with specialized skills, that's still an immense amount of knowledge being lost, and you're praying that the community would have enough, for example, children, and live long enough to try and help them understand, be educated enough about what they will need to do in the future, pass that forward. But again, a huge amount of information is going to get lost. And it's one of the most interesting aspects of this entire narrative, the idea of learning, and that without this, you could be as violent a group as you want, rob and steal and fight among others, be dramatic and over the top with your small kingdom or whatever. But ultimately, without people who have an understanding of basic essential skills, your chances of long-term survival diminish significantly, which is a terrifying thought. Jenny then stumbles upon a man in the woods by a fire. He's got the sickness, and by morning, he's dead. She thinks he might have food, and so looks in his small bag, but it just contains stacks of money. And she realizes, of course, how entirely worthless this is now. We return to Abby, who's showering in her home and has packed her car readying to leave. It's disturbingly quiet. Her husband is still on the sofa, dead. You get this very scary sense of just how alone she is, and the utter silence is terrifying. Upon leaving, she pours fuel throughout and proceeds to burn her house down with her husband inside. Now this really sets things up from where we go from here. We begin to meet other survivors, and eventually they start attempting to make small groups, people to join with. But it's very clear that some have problematic or incompatible ideas, and that becomes a recurring theme early on, that while each group of people may not have enough strength to really challenge or overpower another, they're very specific in attracting people of similar thinking. One of the overarching themes in this series is just how to overcome this and encourage others to want to join you. That sometimes there are individuals who just feel their way is the only way, and if they can't have that, they don't want to remain in a group, and this is established through multiple of the different series. It also addresses ideas about how useful someone is based on their knowledge or abilities, and why others need to start placing value upon you as an individual, somebody with specific knowledge, which is clearly significantly valuable over somebody who knows little to nothing about anything. So a lot of the show is about cooperation, learning to work together, and of course still worrying about immediate survival needs. In the second episode, we meet another key character, Greg, and he will go on through all the series basically. He always has something of an overconfident, almost arrogant attitude. He's very capable, but I find it a little irritating how abrasive he can be with others, but in the circumstances maybe that's what's needed to be a good survivor. We see him arriving back in the UK by helicopter somehow. He finds his wife dead, so he heads out onto the road and is eventually flagged down by a woman. He finds a man, Vic, and this lady, Anne, in an abandoned quarry now, and Vic apparently has created a stockpile of food and whatnot to survive on. But whilst repairing a tractor, it slipped off its jack and has crushed his legs. Greg tries to help and they manage to free him, but without the possibility of real medical care, he realizes they're both pretty much done for. He doesn't really want to get entangled in their situation so early on into this crisis. Anne is pretty clearly quite an unbearable individual. She's quite spoiled, privileged, and has very little skills of any kind. Greg quite keenly notes this to himself, and he basically abandons her driving off, not wanting to have somebody just leeching off of him. But he does say if he can find some medicine, he'll come back to help Vic. Then, later finding the meds he needs in town, he encounters Jenny. They team up. And meanwhile, Anne from the quarry abandons Vic, who is paralyzed, and despite him screaming for help, she leaves him alone, basically to die. Back on the road to the quarry, Greg and Jenny meet Anne, who's coming out, and she lies and tells Greg that he died. Then they all just leave together. Abby, meanwhile, had found a group of men who are acting as some sort of interim local authority. They all seem pretty friendly enough, and she seems glad to be with them. They've got food, they're well organised, but later in the evening there's a disturbance, some sort of confrontation. Some other men arrive, and clearly there's been a struggle outside for stockpiled materials or whatever. They pretty quickly sentence the man to death because he has injured, if not killed, one of their own, and almost immediately he is shot outside.
By the authority vested in a declared state of martial law, the penalty for murder is death. You will be executed. All right. Take him away.
This isn't right! No, this isn't right!
No! No, you have no right to do that! You can't do that!
We'll never get back to any law and order while men like him are allowed to grab power.
Abby realises she doesn't want to stay here with them and escapes. Seemingly then, she sees Greg and the others on the road, and that next evening sets a fire to try and attract people to herself, which I think is a little bit naive, because who knows who might just turn up to you in the middle of the night. Jenny, Greg and Anne are asleep in a barn nearby, and they see the fire. Jenny wants to leave and go and investigate, which also seems a bit incredulous. Greg doesn't seem to care one way or the other, but they tell Anne they're leaving, and she just says she's cold and tells them to leave her alone. They plead with her to come with, but she doesn't want to. So Greg says, well, she's not my responsibility, and they basically just leave her be. He says if there's anybody they find, they'll come back to find Anne here tomorrow. In the end, they meet up with Abby, and by the start of episode 3, Anne has vanished off screen from the barn. Greg seems more than satisfied with not having to bring her along, and then they find a nearby supermarket. They decide they need to get some provisions, but inside they find a man hung dead as a warning. They decide to load up the cars anyway, but as they're doing so, 3 men arrive and say they're part of a group who claim to control the resources in this area, and they threaten to shoot them if they take anything. Outside, Jenny gets a hold of one of the guns, but the lead man in the group walks up estimating she probably won't shoot, until Greg grabs the gun, to which the men take significantly more offense, knowing he definitely would shoot them.
Right over there, all of you! Move!
You're in real trouble now, mate.
You just do as you're told and shut up.
They load up, shoot out the tyres of their Land Rover and drive off very quickly. We get another interesting moment now where Abby basically breaks down somewhat, because she thought quite naively that with so few people having survived the virus, everybody would just naturally want to work together, and that she didn't realise people would not want to cooperate, and even be violent. Greg contributes that eventually, once everybody stops panicking and understands it's in the interests of all to work together, he thinks common sense and human norms will eventually win out. Later, those same 3 men track them down to a church. Jenny, Greg and Abby are using it as a temporary shelter, but it's pitch dark, and by chance, one of the men turns out to be not as violent as the others. By comparison, the other 2 are pretty rough, but this guy sounds pretty ordinary and a nice guy. He basically tells them, stay out of the way while I lead them off. Still, that's a pretty big gamble by the 3. He could have easily just been lying and turned them in, and instead of just running away, they do as he says. But thankfully he doesn't turn them in, and they manage to escape. But the 3 guys take out their car tyres before they leave, as well as taking some or smashing the rest of their supplies, just being vindictive. In episode 4, we come to another of my favourite, albeit quite dark moments for this series, because we meet another major character, Charles. He's recruiting people to his own settlement, and in what is typical for the series, his initial character is a little strange. He's quite obviously adamant about repopulation, which is a valid concern, but he seems quite hyper-focused about getting as many women pregnant as quickly as possible. Now I will note, not necessarily by himself.
Stay here. Stay with Greg, anyone, it doesn't matter. But it does matter now that we have children.
But it's obviously a bit unnerving for the women, and that is actually a story which comes up later down the line again as well.
In the area I've surveyed, we 15 people are the remains of about 75,000. Now, I reckon we've got enough remains of civilization to last for about 2 generations. If we survive the next year or two, and gather our crops, and keep the livestock alive through the winter and beat the rats, and get next season's crop planted, and make very sure that there is a next generation, we'll survive.
But nonetheless, it seems very born out of some actual genuine focus in his mind of survival and building a healthy colony more than anything truly untoward. The 3 characters we've been with so far follow him back to his farm where he's based at, and they find there are other settlers. This is more what they've been looking for, a settled group of seemingly ordinary people trying to get on, not a bunch of men gun-toting, stringing people up over the slightest thing. Except many are apparently randomly now seriously ill whilst Charles has been away, to which he is very panicked. It turns out that unfortunately they had done fishing nearby and the fish have been contaminated, and the other survivors at this settlement are now writhing in agony. They're faced with a horrifying choice: to leave them suffering and hope maybe they recover. Their other option is to put them out of their misery with medical supplies, and they opt for the euthanasia. I have, I think, talked about this before. It's one of those ideas which isn't particularly well illustrated in many other apocalyptic movies or so on, that being that without humans around, certain pieces of infrastructure and supply facilities, containment areas, could break down, releasing chemicals into the land, into the rivers, and you may have no way of knowing what is occurring 50 miles upstream. It could be chemicals which are completely odorless, don't colour the water, and they just get into the fish. You eat the fish and it poisons everybody. And that is a really significant risk. And it could even just be as simple as waste pollution from a water processing centre. It's a very powerful and horrifying thought to throw in on just episode 4, but it does help bring things down to the ground and reinforce this sense of just how real things are. It ties into this idea that although you can try and secure things readily, resources like fish seems very easy, obvious, and safe to do. In actuality, in this scenario, you have no way of knowing what kind of contamination could be occurring now or the next day or the next week or the next month or years. And that's what this series tries to reinforce, these kind of ideas about thinking ahead and understanding what you need to be aware of.
You can't survive on a day-to-day basis. You've got to plan ahead to next year and to 20 years and to 50 years ahead. Love is mutual survival.
Not for me.
But if you were faced with the reality like here in Survivors, what would you actually choose? And that for me underscores just what this series is about. It's about presenting these kind of situations, and it's why I enjoy it above others which focus on the more extreme fantastical circumstances. This series turns the mundane into the horrifying or the serious. These people who barely a week ago were living just normal lives, now facing this entirely new reality and have to learn to exist in this world. You'll have characters who just make token aside comments like, "We're never going to eat another orange ever again," because in all likelihood they will never be able to find that fruit anywhere. The UK, for example, imports obviously loads of fruit and other supplies like tea from abroad. And once all that is gone, the chances of being able to trade that in their lifetimes, extremely minimal. And it's a very sobering reality that they begin to have to grapple with. There's also some really practical problems they face later, which is nothing too abstract or stupid like other settlements declaring war on others and that kind of thing. It's more practical considerations. In the first series, eventually they do have a teacher who's going to be helping the kids learn stuff. In the second series, they start thinking about having a school for the kids and maybe having others coming in and all this kind of thing. Basically starting to try and recreate civilization as they knew it before. But this ends up being far too idealistic. They start off considering that they want to do this, but they realize without mechanization to produce food and other materials that they need to survive, all of these things are very labor intensive. And so really what they need is everybody doing hands-on to make sure their priorities are straight. So all these ideas about creating some kind of functioning colony get pretty sidelined. But there are other settlements, and these come into the picture from time to time. But it's unclear really how some of them support themselves, some have trade going on, others are using resource stockpiles. It's clear as time goes by that some settlements are coming together, making their modest support for themselves and branch out. Others, seemingly from what we hear, you don't see it, but you hear them being more aggressive and starting to develop some kind of almost feudalistic system. I think what's disappointing in the first and the second series, and really the third, you never really drive into those things too significantly, and I think it is a limitation of the series overall, but I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. With all of the series of Survivors, they're trying to follow an arc of the main characters, but they also go off on tangents because they wanted to explore these ideas, but they never really go far enough. So you end up with suggestions of things which could be occurring, but you never really get a rounded out picture with more detail, which is a bit disappointing. In the 5th episode of the first series, they find more survivors, a group of 3 men who are religious and seemingly isolated themselves nearby on a hilltop. And because it's been so long since the initial outbreak, and Abby's still trying to find her son, she goes to them and tries to find out what they know. But we soon learn the virus clearly is still dangerous, as her proximity to them makes them very ill and they all die. So it's clear that just isolation isn't enough. It may well be that any person without immunity, even weeks after, could still be infected by those carrying the virus and then of course cause them to die. This is an oddity for me, because obviously some time has passed since the virus outbreak, and Abby has been around pretty much only other survivors. So you would assume that the virus has basically died at this point and is no longer present. Throughout the series, when they do encounter new people, they usually say to them, "Have you had the sickness?" which also kind of implies that they want to make sure that the person has actually had this death, this virus, and survived, suggesting they have immunity, because they seem to be concerned that if the person comes into their group, maybe they will contract the virus and die. However, later, it begins to be implied more that essentially anybody can come in if they have survived, and that isn't a problem. So there's some inconsistency about how the virus works, and later in the series, and believe the audio dramas, where the implication is that some larger settlements have survived elsewhere because they were far away from any of this kind of contagion. It's also setting up the idea that perhaps if you just stayed away for long enough, you wouldn't get the virus. Nonetheless, it's a bit inconsistent, and I don't think it's particularly commented on. It's kind of by the by to a degree, but it would be good to get a definitive answer just in terms of the long term and knowing, hey, if there was, for example, a city out there somewhere in the world that had maintained full isolation, are there still those kind of resources in the world? Is there a place where you have engineers, doctors, scientists, power running, all this kind of stuff? Because even if you had one major city somewhere in a world which had managed to isolate itself completely, that could be enough to fully restart human civilization as it was. The next few episodes in the series are nothing special. It's mostly them finding new people through one situation and another, until by episode 8 they find a large old building, empty, similar to something like a manor house, a school, or a commune. They decide that they want to set up here and begin figuring out what to do now they've got about 10 people in their group. Greg returns to the quarry to scavenge the supplies where they presume that Vic had died, except he hasn't. Somehow, despite being paralyzed, he managed to survive and even set up a situation of shotguns to cover anybody trying to steal his stash. Eventually, they do get in, and Greg has to break the news to him, and Vic is understandably enraged when he finds out that Greg is the one to return, believing that he'd left him to die. But Greg persuades him that it was in fact Anne who really betrayed him, and Vic comes to his senses. Greg is clearly quite reasonable, and they all travel back to the commune. In episode 9, they deal with a circumstance where there's been a murder in the commune, and it highlights the challenges of an imperfect world where a decision has to be made about something as serious as this, but at what cost? And ultimately, they realise how problematic this is, both in finding evidence, a mock trial, and the sentencing. 10 is one of the few episodes which sees an actual confrontation. A travelling group with a stockpile of goods arrives nearby. They seem quite personable, except that the wife of the group's leader has apparently separated from them with another guy who seems to be her lover. She doesn't want to stay with them and finds Greg in the commune. So a conflict ensues and eventually it leads to a gun battle. And it highlights that whilst rare, when people have strong disagreements or needs in this age without law and order, people will do whatever it takes if their intentions are strong enough. 11 is a really excellent episode because this is where we have Vic, the man paralysed from the quarry, is horrified to see Anne arrive at the commune. Evidently she's been continuing to leech off of others and just found herself here with another guy who she's convinced to be her sort of dog's body whatever. She had no idea that Greg and Jenny were here though, otherwise she would have likely passed on. But having committed herself already to being here, she has to face the reality and eventually Vic for abandoning him to die alone. He forces her into a humiliating, unavoidable confession in front of everyone, and he of course wants to kill her. But ultimately he chooses to rise above this need for vengeance, not wishing to lower himself to her level. With her begging for her life, she stays with Vic and they chat for a time before leaving, and you would imagine that her being cast out could be a very harsh punishment for being such a spoiled individual. But as Anne leaves the commune, she suddenly has a broad smile, indicating perhaps that she has learned again no lesson. That her life has been this continuation of being able to just manipulate people, and I think it's implied that some things will never change, and even in the apocalypse a pretty face and someone adept at manipulating others can do very well for themselves. Episode 12 is another really good one. It highlights some important factors in this new world. A man arrives and seems very friendly enough. He's on his own, his demeanour and personality quite sincere. He finds Greg and the kids fishing in the stream near to the manor. He's invited by Greg to just come in and chat with the group, discusses how he's been wandering alone and not found anywhere to really settle. He just hasn't found the right place for him. Now for some reason, the fact that he's carrying no supplies other than a gun doesn't seem to ring any bells for the group and Greg, which should be a huge red flag. How has he been getting around without any kind of food or blanket for nighttime survival? He's got nothing with him. Instead, they invite him to stay for a short time. And he talks about how there's different forms of survivors around, those stockpiling in something akin to fortress camps, to roaming scavengers and nomads. But ultimately, he comes to the same conclusion that I've noted before, that eventually trading and cooperation will become necessary. So just continually subjugating or fighting among other communities is never going to bring long-term stability. So he seems pretty decent and on the same page. But this entire interaction is a huge error, and I consider this one actually a bit implausible personally. It's one of the few which I find pretty irritating, because they give this random man just way too much trust right from the outset, when we're shown at other times they are incredibly cautious. So inevitably, when he moves on in the middle of the night, we discover that's because in actuality, he's got a small group himself nearby. He's not a lone wanderer, and their plan of him and a couple of other guys is to just raid and steal the fuel tanker that Greg and the group have at the commune. And this is made worse by the fact that that same night there's very heavy rainfall, it floods the basement of the manor, and this is where they've been storing their food provisions. Now on the one hand, storing underground is going to keep that temperature consistent, but the flooding ruins all their supplies in one night. Plus you're in the UK, it doesn't really get that hot here. So it's again an example of things not being well thought through. If it were me, you'd want to separate those supplies out around the property as best as is feasible, because you want to have some, safeguarding that if some gets stolen or damaged in some way, you've got a backup. And those old manor houses are massive. They're made of stone. The temperatures inside are often cooler than outside in the summer, and they're going to have large larders from the age in which they were built. This place is far bigger than the amount of people they've got staying there, so requiring to store a lot of your goods in the basement really didn't seem necessary, and now they've all just got ruined. The loss of this means their fuel is all the more vital because they're going to need it to trade for food and whatever else they need. So now when the men come to steal this, it makes the consequences and the pressures very severe. But Greg and Jenny have headed off to another community where they know they can trade this fuel for food and for seed for growing crops. but the brakes of the vehicle have failed and they're forced to temporarily hide it in a nearby barn. So when the men attack back at the commune and learn the fuel is gone, they get back on the road quickly to search for it, and they run into Jenny returning to get the tools to fix the truck, not knowing their intentions. Although, again, she doesn't really have a red flag come up about the fact that this guy has suddenly got some companions, whereas before he was on his own. Nonetheless, she doesn't really have a lot of choice about it, and she returns with them to show where Greg is, and then a hostage situation ensues, with a small gunfight. Greg tells them he'd rather burn it all than let them steal it. At which point, an interesting and another great example of this show's more grounded nature emerges. The men clearly thought that taking this fuel would just be an easy win for them. They've been saying this throughout, that they basically just want to get the fuel and leave, they don't want any big trouble. But now, they're stuck in this gunfight with somebody willing to basically go down with the ship, and that's not what they were banking on.
When we make our move, we've got to do it right.
Look, Jim, it's gone wrong on us. Why don't we just forget it? No, it's not worth any of us getting hurt.
And it raises this point about how realistic it is for groups to always be fighting in an apocalyptic scenario, because even minor wounds could be life-threatening. They also realise that losing one of their 3 members is going to be very damaging to their ability for the other 2 to continue living their life. Nonetheless, one of their number seems really determined, perhaps just on principle or ego, to win and get that fuel. So this standoff occurs. Greg and Jenny are trapped inside the barn, but he manages to get her away so she can take their jeep to get reinforcements, and she goes off. But Greg is left behind on his own, and he cannot hold off 3 guys coming at him from all different directions into the barn, and eventually they manage to take the tanker. However, they're totally unaware that its brakes have failed. Soon after going down a steep hill, they crash, and the impact kills 2 of the men. The last one, who was so intent on securing it, has become very distraught that he's brought this situation upon them and himself, and he makes a pitiful attempt at fighting, starts pouring the fuel out of the tanker. As Greg has pursued them, he grabs a shotgun and shoots the guy at close range, instantly killing him. Greg laments that this is what a life is worth now, 3 dead and 50 gallons of petrol per man. It's a good point, and it underscores, again, how stupid fighting really for anything is in this time, because had those 3 men just joined the commune, they would have had a good situation. They could have traded up the fuel, got resources they needed, and all helped to make it work, strengthening the group. Instead, the entire opposite situation has occurred, and now they're dead. I think this really goes to underscore the difference in this show compared to others, because it's not just about survival, it's about the worth of a life. And there are many series where they're pretty flippant with just killing off people because they need that dramatic impact. But in these circumstances, what your life can mean to others is as important as it can be to yourself. The final episode in the first series starts off with an issue that would likely be more than typical in an actual end-of-the-world scenario. That is, everybody bickering and arguing. They're trying to figure out what to do next at the commune, and everybody's at each other's throats. It's a classic scenario that anybody who's ever been on a team-building day will recognise, because they've got no clearly designated leader, and they're trying to hear others' opinions, they're trying to discuss what to do, they're trying to lay blame, and it all falls into argument very quickly. The situation is apparently Greg has come back having traded 200 gallons of their fuel, but he brought back with him bad seed for the crops, and they're trying to figure out how to handle this. They're discussing whether the people they traded with knew it or not and what they need to do about it. Clearly under a lot of pressure, it's starting to bring everything to a point. With no way of getting crops in, no real livestock, not much to trade with, the group are struggling to figure out how they can feed everyone and what the future of their group looks like. Abby decides to just leave the discussion and go off to bed because she's had enough of it all, which is when you start to get that feeling that the groups who are not planning well, they don't have enough supplies, inevitably are going to start breaking apart and feed into other communities. Now, that need not necessarily be a bad thing. With no support network of a government, those who fail to plan well, store, secure their needs, it's going to lead to a situation where people just abandon a community and go looking for others that are doing better. And in this example, that is exactly what's taking place. So it is helping us to see, even though it's not necessarily illustrated, how a real-world apocalypse could lead to these larger-scale communities existing, which slowly see a bleed of people joining, who have failed in their own attempts due to poor decisions, leadership, or unfavourable conditions. To make things worse, they discover their chickens have been slaughtered by foxes. And so, to add to their pressures, then a small group arrive at the entrance. They're on foot with carts, there's about 10-15 people, and they describe how they were doing quite well with a farm 50 miles north. But then several other groups formed up to something of a local government and demanded a tithe from the group at the farm in exchange for protection. They told them, no, piss off, and then were subsequently forced out by a militia. He describes how they're a rough bunch, although we don't have a lot more information than this. It seems a not particularly well-made decision on behalf of that group. They had a farm, they were working. He says they didn't have enough to share, but sharing doesn't have to be just about food. If you look into feudal systems, there's other means by which you can accommodate that kind of thing. You can do service and whatnot. You can try and share and trade. Now, of course, the community who were trying to come after and ask for a share of their food could have been entirely unreasonable, and so it's fair that he's just come away. But you would also like to imagine that communities which have survived so far have something of a logical grounding. It just doesn't make any sense that they would say, give us all your food, knowing that they're leaving those people to die, because then next year you've got nobody to give you any food. Whilst from a narrative point of view, a television or movie point of view, yes, that's very dramatic. Give us your food, we don't care. And you think, yes, that's those ruffians, they don't have a good idea in their head. I think in the real world, people would understand, well, look, we'll take some of what you've got and we will protect you because it's in our interests to protect you because you're supplying us food. That all makes sense. This is one of the examples that is annoying to me that they don't follow it through. But with Survivors, the continuity of storylines is a bit fractured and fragmented because they are trying to talk about a lot of different things. This idea at this point in time, for me, I would like to see that explored more. I want to know, well, what is happening with that larger community and so on. They just never really get there. Because in actuality, having an organised community which protects nearby groups, farms from raids by bandits and this kind of thing, that's pretty much how feudal society would have worked from Europe to Asia. You're going to need also some kind of warning system to be able to summon those people to come to your farm when you need them. And in an apocalypse of severe depopulation like Survivors, this is the sort of societal structure that is going to be most likely to develop, probably quite well suited also to this scenario. And again, it is very frustrating for me that this wasn't further explored in this series really, because it would have made seasons 2 and 3 far more interesting, where a power center has control over nearby land and those who farm it. In exchange, they can provide a safe area for things like education, legal authority, and so on. Instead, Survivors in Series 3, they pretty much just go on this kind of odyssey of little pocketed communities, and they're just encountering the same problems again and again in different scenarios. Now, you'd always hope that a larger, well-managed group community is going to be benevolent, but in the end of the world scenario, you're going to have to take the cards you're dealt. Certainly in Season 2, where they struggle to run a farm, some sort of centralized nearby authority, good or bad, would have been an interesting factor to introduce, and is sadly missing. Now back to the travelling group who arrived. They've got a sick woman with them and ask if she can stay. This is obviously a huge burden for the commune at their current time. They discuss it and decide to send them on their way, considering the sick woman too much of a risk on top of their other problems they have. But they also agree they need to start trying to work with these other groups before it's too late and they themselves get run off their land. Soon they discover that the travelling group have just left the sick woman here after all, and they themselves have disappeared, so now they're forced to deal with her. Abby decides to take her in. Greg forcefully disagrees, but she pushes him out of the way. It's clear her and Greg are both strong, clear-minded individuals, and a leadership conflict there is present. But she also seems to have basically had enough of this group, and she's trying to decide what she wants to do. They have a heated conversation, and honestly, both their positions I think are fairly valid. Greg is seeing things from a pure survival view, above any ethics position, and says they should have just made the lady comfortable and left her to her own devices. If she dies, whatever. Abby says if they don't look after somebody who's very sick, they don't deserve to survive at all. And of course, the consequences for her being taken care of come back around shortly. The other guys in the group are figuring how they're going to get messages to nearby communities, and they send off the older business gentleman to deliver messages to them nearby. Abby goes off to meet with a man, and she finds him miraculously that we met in a previous episode, a love interest of sorts, but the storyline for me is pretty tedious, so I won't expand on it. It's basically them just being together. Greg, meanwhile, slips a saw whilst he's cutting wood and cuts badly through his arm. It underscores again that without any medical care and knowledge, minor injuries pose severe risks, and something like this is certainly life-threatening. But they patch him up as best they can, but really, they can't do very much. The sick woman is now awake and recovering, but when she sees Greg, realizes they need to deal with his arm immediately, because it's so severe he's still wearing a tourniquet which he's releasing pressure of. The woman, Ruth, reveals that she's actually a third-year medical student, not a qualified doctor, but still has considerably more knowledge than anybody else. She tells her story and then reveals how she's come into contact with none other than Abby's son, who apparently, by all odds, has survived. The end of the series then is somewhat anticlimactic. Abby returns to the commune with her man, and a few people from other communities are arriving to discuss working together. And that's about it. It's a semi-hopeful ending. In some respects it sets things up for the next series, but unfortunately, as becomes typical for the show, a lot of storylines just end up abandoned or not continued with. Now, because of time constraints, I don't want to go further and rake through all of Season 2 and 3. There are some other interesting developments which see them return to working with Charles, who we met earlier in this first season. They do get out and encounter other groups, including some that are strange, like a weird dystopian military base. They head to London and find it in a terrible state, with the area in question being run again by a somewhat dystopian group. Much later in Series 3, there are issues about men with knowledge of engineering and technology, like generating electricity and so on, the possibility of operating a hydroelectric station, coal and this kind of thing, and they have to decide about whether or not they should be turning power back on, which honestly is an absurd thing to consider not doing. Obviously turn it back on, like for God's sake. It's not the time for a philosophical discussion. I do like the idea though of one guy just having that knowledge and wouldn't do it, that he would just basically say, F you, I'm not doing it. That seems very human, and just leave everybody in a world without electricity. Survivors in Series 2 is quite good in my opinion, much of it focusing on the farm of Charles and their struggles to make things work for them in terms of basic necessities. It's quite positive overall, but they still find many problematic people coming and going who are too short-sighted, aggressive to function, and so on. There are other issues with infection, poor decisions, and their overall progress toward a functioning stable community is still pretty slow. And as with Season 3, unfortunately continuity becomes an issue. Abby, for example, is just not seen again. Her storyline is only resolved in an audiobook format off-screen. Other events happen off-screen as well, and it's unfortunately the beginning of the edges of the overall narrative starting to fray. Season 3 does attempt to address issues like market trading, logistics, utilities, as well as how other communities are establishing themselves. And while it makes some attempt to look at the broader picture, it is quite evident that continuity and budget still are an issue, and it makes this series feel weaker to me overall. Things jump around, like I said, it's a bit of an odyssey. Some storylines seem important, others end abruptly and are just not mentioned again. There's a lot of random token events which occur, like where Charles finds some people with a steam engine. It's interesting as a concept, but it takes place effectively in isolation. He meets with other communities and suggests, hey look, we should be working together, and they basically say, piss off, we're doing our own thing, which again is understandable, but within the context of the series feels kind of unconstructive and a bit disillusioning at that point in time. Now, despite the fact the 2008 reboot was a poor showing, from 2014 through to 2023, an audio drama series was established which continues the story from the 1975 show, and this does make significant inroads to building up additional context and narrative with basically a lot of my criticisms. Things that they were just unable to be seen through in the original show, like trade, cooperation towards building a larger community, character story arc resolutions, and so on. They even managed to get some of the original actors to participate, which is great. Less great is that only the first 3 seasons are on Audible, which I mentioned from more of an affordability point of view. The rest are on the site of the publisher Big Finish itself, and they're priced at an eye-watering £25 or $35 for basically 4 hours content. Those are on my wait for a sale or other source list to get, and so I haven't been able to listen to those yet. Anyway, that's my introduction overview for Survivors. I think it's very worth your time to check it out, but next I want to talk about one of the reasons why it stands apart from most other apocalypse series or movies, that being its very grounded state and why a convincing apocalypse scenario matters. So Survivors had a reboot back in 2008, but this was unfortunately cringe 2000s fare, just extremely mid and is often the case incomparable to that cold, unintentionally gritty realism you get from the late 70s and early 80s. Often, things which resonate today from that era do so entirely unintentionally, driven by low budgets and just a need at the time to compromise on special effects. However, what people of that era could never have known is that despite these factors sometimes meaning things might look a little rough around the edges, at least your brain can see it's all right there, grounded and real, which perhaps in this genre most of all carries a lot of weight as a viewer, because seeing people in outdoor environments, not just a studio all the time, not seeing things heavily manicured, really qualifies a lot in terms of you being immersed. Survivors itself was written and created by legendary British sci-fi author Terry Nation, who wrote many scripts for Doctor Who in its original format, and others like Blake's Seven. Survivors, though, was only broadcast in the UK as far as I can tell, and so had a very limited exposure, perhaps more importantly also an absurdly small budget. Now, apocalypse drama has always been popular, but I think in the last 10 years we've seen, for obvious reasons, a particular resurgence, even seeing Threads become a widely known benchmark for nuclear apocalypse docudrama, having gained global attention for its reputation of being just especially bleak and showing an unrestrained, harrowing portrayal of human survival. For as impactful as Threads is, and I do greatly appreciate it as a piece of material, it's not flawlessly accurate. But then neither was Chernobyl by a wide margin, and to just say Threads is actually having a reboot of itself, which is going to be interesting, and I'll probably talk about that when it comes along or just before. Both of those dramas, though, play off most of all from the sheer nightmare scale of the circumstance, because when it comes to the specifics, they certainly play a little fast and loose for typically sensational reactions. In Chernobyl, one of the most obvious is when they're finding survivors just after the explosion at the power plant. One of the technicians just starts pouring blood out of himself like a sieve, and this obviously just isn't what happens. There are nuclear experts as well you can find on YouTube just reviewing the show. There's a lot of criticism of Chernobyl, and doctors as well who have testified as much. Because despite the extreme radiation there that would 100% it's going to kill you, you just don't within the first hour or less start pouring blood out of you. But if you just go and find random creators reacting to that moment on a YouTube clip, then their mouths are going to be agape at the shock and horror that, oh my god, I didn't know that could happen. And that's entirely the point. It couldn't happen, but it's shocking for sure. It's just not at all accurate. It's just shock moment value to maintain engagement with the story and the horror of what's happening. Now, the reason I note this, and I will talk about it more as well, is because Survivors, by comparison, is very, very bland. And I think it's because of this, paired with its little-known reputation, that it seems barely on anybody's radar. Threads would still not be created until 1984, and when it did, that was designed to shock people into paying attention to the horror of nuclear weaponry, and likely eclipsed all that came before. Because Threads came as a sense of waking people up. It was designed to basically hit people with a sledgehammer as to the consequences of nuclear war, and that's why it was so upsetting and so renowned. But I think so much so that nobody really remembered 5 years prior, Survivors attempted to explore the question of how people would react in the event of a mass global pandemic, specifically where the virus has an extremely high mortality rate, causing as much as 99% of the population to be killed. Bleak, far more grounded, and typical of late 70s sci-fi, more akin to something like Crichton's Andromeda Strain. It's not to say that conflicts would not occur in an apocalyptic and lawless scenario, because they do, and they do happen in Survivors as well. What it's more about for me is that it's addressed in a convincing way, which in many shows, a lot of the time, it is not. In Survivors, there are occasional gunfights, but they're very, very toned down compared to what we might see in modern shows with fully automatic assault rifles, bows, all sorts of different things. The fact that they're so toned down actually makes it more believable. It's not shocking and dramatic, it's just bang, you're dead. And that's actually addressed even really in the first episode, when the situation is abundantly clear that resources are going to be problematic, and that even from the outset, generally, things are getting kind of bad already. There's this sense that maybe, we don't start Death Race 2029 in the second week of things going tits up, but nonetheless, people are getting pretty edgy. But what makes it more immersive for me is that while confrontations do naturally occur, even early on, but especially after the initial panic and the shock of what's happened has set in, the natural problems that people are facing about food, health, the elements, those become the more severe problems than just other people. And that's really, I would say, a fundamental core of what the show is about. Yes, humans can be problematic, you're going to have issues, but the more fundamental issues are, can you stay warm and dry? Can you eat food? Can you stay safe? And you just don't really get that very often with apocalypse shows or any kind of shows which are about people surviving and enduring in some terrible situation. Whereas in Survivors, when new people are encountered, they are treated with caution, but not immediately as a threat, because most people in the show are usually just as desperate for cooperation as everybody else. And in its full culmination, as have some other fictional scenarios, they end up asking bigger questions about, should we even start rebuilding things as they were, or do we just need to go in a completely different direction now? And this to me is what I think of in terms of being a convincing apocalypse, because you're always going to have, crazies, bandits from time to time. But most communities aren't just warring with each other or having some grand ideological crisis, certainly not so early on. They're not trying to force others into submission with ever-increasing acts of brutality, because they know that in doing so they're just hurting themselves in the long run. Now, I will say in the series as well, there are episodes which deal with communities which have different ideological views, but even then, they are relatively civil with one another. They're not just immediately like, you don't agree with us, so we're going to kill you on the spot. It just doesn't work like that. And this to me is another factor which makes the series, compared to others, on just a different, more grounded level. One which I really wish could be handled in a competent way in a more modern production. And one last thing within that idea of grounded apocalypse, but also just generally something that I cannot bear in terms of any narrative, and I'm sure you would agree is universally hated but still takes place with astonishing regularity, is seeing breaks of internal logic when it comes to decision making or characters being significantly or implausibly out of character. Of course, we know the reason why. It's because a story demands X becomes Z, and so Y has to occur. So no matter that Greg or Jenny would never have done it, based on everything we know about them, they're still going to do this thing because the screenwriter demands that. And this is why modern series like Picard got hammered so brutally in reviews. How do you screw up doing fan service to some of the most famous characters in science fiction? You ruin it because the writers apparently haven't got a bloody clue what they're doing. And then on top of that, unfortunately, the audience you're pitching to are just not idiots. Did nobody watch the series on which this was based upon? It's incomprehensible, but this we see time and time again. In apocalypse shows, that kind of character breakdown also applies to individuals who have only endured a few months of a collapsed civilization, but somehow they're already riding a horse and acting like it's Mad Max or Fallout. It stretches believability. It's like, Andrew, weren't you an insurance salesman last week? Now he's got like double shotguns or whatever. It's just that meme of, so when do we need to start wearing assless chaps, Mohicans, and cut pieces of tire for shoulder guards? Is it 2 weeks into the apocalypse or a bit longer? It does give me genuine narrative whiplash when something changes too abruptly and with little or no reason for doing so, as I recently mentioned regarding 40k, of course. But when a show or movie dealing with societal collapse delivers the establishing details in a condensed version, usually at best the first episode, or worse, the first 15 minutes, potentially 10 minutes if it's a movie, then bang, we jump ahead and it's full apocalypse. Without much reason, everybody is now out here indiscriminately killing their friend of 20 years. And why? Because they're crushing hard on that friend's wife or something. Because there's no laws. And obviously everybody's just going to go straight to the nuclear option of murder because that's just what anybody would do. No, because most people are still just people and they're governed by their own established views. That's why civilization works. Of course, there's going to be some shifts. People might abandon hope and throw some of the rules out the window, but not the majority of people. And that's why in ancient times, people weren't getting murdered left, right and centre over the most mild thing. Admittedly, if they did, pretty good chance they weren't going to get caught, and that's why punishments tended to be really extreme, because 99% you won't get caught, but if you do, it's going to be horrible. That's why often punishments in the ancient times were really, really bad. But by and large, most ordinary people understand, hey, if we all just go around killing each other, eventually that's going to come back on us. It's not really the best way to run a community. But of course, in TV shows and movies, we need our drama in the story, so, who cares, right? Except it's not. It's not dramatic, it's not interesting even, it's tedious. It's insulting to the audience, and I hate it, because it's so implausible. Yes, Johnny survived the end of the world, but now he's really focused in on how to solve that love triangle situation. It's like, mate, didn't you notice that human civilization has been completely destroyed? Like, for God's sake, get your priorities straight. And I can't remember if I mentioned it in the first video, but one of my favourite moments which contrasts that kind of stupidity is in the original Romero Dawn of the Dead. The characters are just escaping the collapsing city, overrun by zombies, and one of the two police officers, Peter, played by the amazing Ken Foree, turns to the only woman in their group, Fran, and he says to her, having basically just met her,
"See you, man?"
Most of the time.
Just like to know who everybody is.
Yeah, me too.
And this always hits me as so wildly rare among this genre, because you get this real sense of human sincerity and warmth in that moment, in that character, and it diffuses right away any potential confusion and tension there, so that they can just focus on what they need to be worried about: the helicopter fuel, food, water, and a secure place to shelter, which to me just seems way more believable and more just human as a character. Whereas a lot of apocalypse shows or even movies can tend to get over-invested in the interpersonal relationships between their characters. What would make me feel actually invested is a character's sense of worth. What do they contribute? How valuable are they to the team? Will we get to see their plans come to fruition? Start making some plans. Tell us about those plans. Tell us about your experience and why you think it's a good idea, and rationalize and discuss. We get to see them trying to make that come to fruition. How they're able to learn and discover knowledge. Maybe they need to do some scavenging missions of libraries. Maybe they start to develop an interesting ideology based on their overarching goals. Basically, do something, do anything other than X is going to kill Y because he looked at him kind of funny. I'm not saying you can't demonstrate personal relationships, because if I'm not being cynical, I think you can see that sometimes the idea here is to display that people haven't lost their humanity. I get that, of course. It's just that in a show like Survivors, it's handled in a believable, again convincing manner. It takes time, and it's not just confrontational or dramatic. Whereas in many other shows, it always seems to just facilitate this lazy writing where it exists only to make the audience invest emotionally to later heighten the shock and trauma of their demise. Movies will have this background of devastating global ecological societal breakdown, but they focus on a more linear storyline. Usually, given it's an apocalypse, it's a world which has suffered some major damage, ecological or otherwise. In the case of Blade Runner, those who are able to have already left the planet, with those unsuited or just unable to make the move, are left behind in the decaying remnants of the world. In Soylent Green, it's kind of the same, but in a sort of opposite way. Overpopulation is the problem, although with a slightly more vibrant 1970s veneer. And I've often thought that the movie itself needs to be remade, hopefully by somebody with some directing acumen, because Soylent Green suffered from being very much of its era. It's a little absurd, it's a little silly in places, especially its movie trailer, and on paper it's actually a very harrowing core narrative, very dystopian, and one that ended up becoming a bit of a joke, unfortunately, and even now people see it, and because of the style of the movie, it's seen as being a bit silly. But I really think the story itself and elements of the movie are really bleak, and I really should do a deeper dive on it, because I think the core story gets lost amid this more sensational revelation in Soylent Green itself, which many people will know. But I think it's quite this dark film if you go into it without any previous references. Soylent Green 1973, go watch it. But if you want high-octane drama, guns all over the place, and huge cliffhangers, then 1975 Survivors is not that show. It's about as far from that as is possible to be. However, if you're after a show where people reasonably discuss how they're going to deal with being the few humans left to survive the aftermath of a global highly lethal pandemic, and worry about minor injuries that would never even receive a passing mention in contemporary shows, but in this series could be lethal, then you've come to the right place. But also there's this fact that, like I say, everybody isn't trying to just constantly screw each other over. Now there's still a twist of things along the way, albeit more believable, but ultimately one of my first questions for any apocalypse drama is, what is the purpose of the material? Is it primarily to educate or to entertain, or both? And from there you can begin to then assess how convincing, grounded or plausible it needs to be, and how much space we allow for suspension of disbelief. And in Survivors, very much, it's trying to generate conversation about practically and realistically how would you deal with these different situations, and it just does a hell of a lot better job than pretty much anything else I can think of. To go in the complete opposite direction of things that are completely useless, one of the most tedious examples are the innumerable low-budget offerings of apocalypse bunker movies. So much so, it's almost its own genre. The breakdown for these kind of movies, if you want to call them that, is some kind of apocalyptic event happens, the sun blows up, whatever, and then everybody runs into a bunker. The people are just trapped in there. You don't have to have basically any sets. You don't have to have any budget whatsoever. Human drama ensues. Maybe one of them goes crazy or whatever. It's all a load of rubbish. The only good examples of that kind of format might be something like 10 Cloverfield Lane, or I did think with a comedy twist, Blast from the Past. Not really an apocalypse drama, but it's a fun movie. But the end of our civilized world will always be something that people are fascinated in having a conversation about, no matter whatever vehicle or tone you choose to deliver that with. And really what we're talking about is threat portrayal. Now, I wouldn't suggest that in the name of entertainment it should be a hard rule to only portray things one-to-one real life. I think clearly that would just be tedious. On the other hand, there is a question to be asked about what impression people will come away from something with, and how, especially if it's a more documentary format drama rather than just plain fiction, perhaps things should lean a little more toward being accurate. It's one thing to marvel at the horror of humanity, but it's another for people to come away just not grasping a core underlying message within a reasonable framework. I think Chernobyl, similarly to Threads, leans on, well, it's so bad, why not just scare people as much as possible angle. That's fine, I guess, but for as much as it was widely praised, and I also really enjoyed it, it's an amazing piece of drama, portrayed extremely well by stellar actors throughout. But for anybody who has read up about Chernobyl over the years, or just kind of has an awareness about some degree of physics, it was pretty clear that it made some quite large steps around reality. All the more bizarre given how at the end of the series it listed key participants and their ultimate fate. Evidently confusing for many people who watched the show and then got to the end and went, oh. And more strange, even the show itself seemed to be aware of that, because it presented certain things like, for example, the divers who went in under Chernobyl to drain the water out. It presented it almost like a plot twist. They did the subtitles and then a pause and then it says like, they lived. That to me is a really weird angle for such a disaster. It really illustrates how the juxtaposition of reality versus entertainment horror was pretty questionably executed. And as I noted already, showing people spontaneously bleeding or just dying in extremely graphic ways like a horror movie is far more emotionally evocative in the condensed time frame of an episode than just saying, oh yeah, people got really sick. Of course, those who really did suffer the worst did endure horrible ends, but even then, if we're getting specific, if you look into it, the portrayal in the show is just considerably more extreme, abstract and just almost imagined compared to reality. And you might want to say, well, it's just a show, it's just entertainment, what does it matter? The trouble with that is, when it's a documentary drama, accuracy is kind of important. I'm not saying this just to bash the show, because like I say, it's one of my quite favoured series addressing apocalyptic scenarios, and I certainly enjoyed it as much as you can for a highly troubling event in human history, but ultimately the point is that anything which gets people to go and do wider reading or research to educate themselves isn't a bad thing. At the same time though, dropping realism for shock isn't something that I think serves history or material or pays respect to the people of that time very well. And this connects for me the difference between something like Chernobyl and Survivors, because when it comes to threat portrayal, how that is handled directly feeds into what people will then take away from the content, and that appears to be exactly the case here. For while Survivors leaves you considering real questions about practical survival, Chernobyl gives you wild falsehoods like how the baby in the mother's womb just absorbed all the radiation. That's not just questionable science, it's flat wrong. But of course, with apocalypse material as well, a subplot which often tends to be made is that humans in general are not good at learning from our past. And I think all of this together is why I've always leaned towards those more realistic takes. And adjacent to this is comically why I always found the Doomsday Preppers show to be an entertaining guilty pleasure, mainly because whoever they had on the show at a given time, they're laying out their survival plans with astute confidence. I'm going to do this, I know how to do it. Then they just cut to the experts who are like, yeah, they're going to die in the first 24 hours. I recall one specific episode in Doomsday Preppers where they had people in like a local community, a rural one, and they'd made a collective decision in this group that if things ever kind of went down, they'd all just gather to this person's small piece of land where everybody would focus on learning specific traditional skills. And it was one of the more constructive versions that I recall, because it wasn't just let's stockpile materials and guns. Instead, they were proactively learning skills, which admittedly did make it seem like more of a hobby for them than, some real plan for the end of the world. The key detail for me here, the connect, is that similarly to Survivors, they held this unusual perspective in that they were fairly anti-violence and believed that they wouldn't necessarily encounter anybody who wanted to just take their stuff, and if they did, they could discuss their way around it. Initially, you might think that's extraordinarily naive for people planning for the end of the world. On the other hand, if you see and consider how things play out in Survivors, maybe they were actually onto something. I admit it's a bit of a risky dice roll, but in a true apocalypse scenario, is it really worth fighting over a pack of beans? Or is it better to actively work together and say, hey, come and join us, increase our greater chances of survival, increase our manpower? And the point is that when you distill all that I'm talking about down, the added realism, the human drama, the somewhat documentary style, historical accuracy, then 1975 Survivors for me is pretty close to being everything I want in that sort of a show. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, far from it, but it does a better job within its constraints of illustrating what people might actually face during a high mortality pandemic. It does a better job of illustrating ideas that get lost in those more dramatic narratives, which very often, when they talk about rebuilding some semblance of society, they conveniently just miss out the fact that individuals themselves rarely have the specific knowledge to build the means of production like I've talked about before. So whether it's Walking Dead, Revolution, The Last of Us, and so on, the major hurdle is not always the thing which is occurring, it's knowledge, and that gets glossed over way too readily. So threat portrayal is important for me in apocalypse narratives because, along with the event itself, how people act and engage with others is key to the level of immersion. Writers desire to crowbar in exciting moments, and this can lead to a lot of dumb situations where you end up just asking, wait, why are they arguing about this? Is this really worth it? Somebody out of the extremely finite pools of humans now just going to lose their life? It can really become quite silly for anybody with half a mind. Far from just making things more dramatic and pulling me into a show, I often will find the opposite. When I see people fighting about something incredibly trivial, it shatters my immersion in what's happening because it just seems so incredibly stupid, and I just end up then barely caring about what's happening with other characters. If this is what they're going to fight about, who cares if they die? And there's a core 40k reference to put in here too, which is that in 40k, for the Imperium and specifically Mechanicus, the retention and learning of knowledge is above all else, and that positions people in that faction. The more you know, the more powerful, the more valuable you are, and you shouldn't just be thrown away. That's why the members of the Mechanicus will go to extreme lengths to extend their life, because basically knowledge is all. And that is a core idea which doesn't get illustrated particularly well in the vast majority of apocalypse dramas. In fact, in apocalypse scenarios, it's common for many shows to just lean on this idea that humans become instantly barbaric, not civilized. And that's just because it's dramatic, it's upsetting, it's horrific, it's scary. It really would be just the most stupid thing to not keep somebody around, even if their lot in life just becomes doing menial labor. Now, of course, there's exceptions. Nobody's going to easily tolerate, say, a thief, a murderer, an abuser in a small colony. These are just key human red lines. Any community is going to reject that sort of person pretty fast, whereas a show like Survivors goes the other way. The members of the group really don't want to resort to something as severe as execution, but sometimes they have no choice, which to me hits a lot harder. There's some episodes where they literally will spend a huge amount of time trying to decide, what are we going to do with this person? Other times, especially early on in the series, they'll just, if there's somebody problematic, they'll just drive away and leave them. And there's the implication, which just being left on your own is kind of a death sentence in itself. And all of that hits, for me, a lot harder than just crazed warlord man decides to inflict violence for any reason. You got to remember, we're not living in the ancient human times. These are people who have come from modern civilization and are adjusting to new situations. So even a year or two down the line, I don't think people are going to tolerate for very long some mad person who just starts punishing people arbitrarily at every opportunity. Disagree with me if you wish, and maybe I'm wrong on this, especially considering I'm arguing for a 1975 show that nobody knows versus dramas that are established names. I'm not lost or unaware about this, and in truth I'm just having a bit of fun here with this argument. And this is why, despite them being zombie movies, Romero's Dead trilogy, Night, Dawn and Day of the Dead, resonate really well. So while the third Dead movie does take the gore to a whole other level, and obviously the films are dealing with not exactly a threat we expect to face or see, overall they're handled in this Romero raw documentary-ish style. And like Survivors, it's this raw lack of finesse that you don't often see from other filmmakers and especially contemporary filmmakers, but that works to its benefit. In those classic movies, you're more focused on how people are handling the situation. It's not about the gore, it's not about the zombie, you're more focused on the characters and how people are handling the situation, because that's what you are thinking about by putting yourself in that position. It's about how characters interact, how believable they are, not how amazing can we make the zombie makeup. Like, for sure, that is a good thing, but those other aspects are way, way more important. And to make another Dawn of the Dead reference, another one I just quite like is when they're refueling the helicopter trying to leave the city at a police dock. We see Joe Pilato, who takes on a greater role later in Day of the Dead, playing these cops who show up and they're also running out of the city. Both groups arrive at the dock, and for a moment there's a standoff. It seems like a tense situation, but then he just exclaims, we'd be crazy to start shooting at each other. So they just don't, and then everybody gets what they need, and they head off in their separate ways, and it's fine. It's just a good example of how I think in another situation for a different show or audience, they could have played that up as a dramatic moment, a shootout where there's a struggle and so on, but they just don't, because it's kind of like, hey, if we just leave each other alone, we'll just get what we need and be out of the way, which just seems more grounded. In Survivors, the peaceful group who work very hard for what they have, they're willing to defend it, and even cast people out if necessary. There's several episodes which see them fight off others, and while this isn't a core theme for the show, confrontation, they still balance it well enough that when a threat does arrive, it then feels more believable and serious. So this is what I consider in terms of threat portrayal. I feel how that's handled very much defines apocalypse narratives and sets your expectations and how immersed into a story you will become. And that for me is really everything. Firstly, I appreciate you joining me on this atypical video for the channel today, and hardly a short one at that. And I believe this will be my last video where I reference apocalypse media from a more broad overview position, where I'm spending time talking about my personal likes and dislikes in quite a vague way, things that capture my imagination and so on. With any piece that I want to do next, I want to dial in more specifically on giving an analysis, be that of a movie, game or piece of history like a civilization collapse. I already mentioned threads as a possibility. Perhaps I could combine and face off two examples against one another in why they're better or worse in different ways, that kind of thing. Or perhaps just real-world situations which nearly reached a point of becoming an apocalyptic collapse somehow, but were then narrowly averted. If you want to list or suggest any of those below, please do so. One of the reasons as to why this topic is so captivating for me is because it bleeds off into so many possible tangents of speculation, discussion, and just interest. You could also very easily tie that in, as I say, with 40k, because you're talking about the downfall of humanity there in the dark age of technology. It's something outside their control. There's recurring themes in apocalypse narratives about touching upon forbidden technology, and the recurring warnings about technological overreach, or just the fact that they have no ability to use technology which they know exists but is obviously far outside of their understanding. Progress measured with restraint, for example. Or as we discussed today with Survivors, the idea of what if an event caused a severely reduced population and then created lives that were in many respects simpler, albeit harder. Such ideas can often frame the narrative of a collapse as being very brutal, but then in emerging from the aftermath become more ideologically clear-minded. It's this idea of a full reset. And I think there is a discussion to be had about whether the rise and fall of civilizations is not just a random occurrence that comes from time to time, but is in fact due to human nature and the limited ways in which we structure societies. Is it all but inevitable, or to take it a step further, maybe even necessary? I think that's one of the reasons why post-apocalyptic fiction endures and still resonates, because of our own human nature, our inability to process the true scale of trauma, things caused by war, and entirely outside of our own control. You literally see that today, where in our world of war and devastation, close to unimaginable consequences for many are happening, yet people in everyday life barely mention it, because it doesn't touch them and it's outside their control. It doesn't immediately impact anyone around them. Often the spectre of civil war becomes a topic of conversation in the last decade or so. It's interesting how often people who have never experienced any kind of real-world conflict or violence can be so quick to talk about and call for such things. So collapse and apocalypse fiction helps to distill our anxieties from this abstract scale of war into more manageable, identifiable personal stakes. So apocalypse narratives tend to lean on that. They turn these larger concepts and scenarios ordinarily too distant and abstract for us to place ourselves into more straightforward and into lived or at least adjacent experiences. Because in most fiction, it is our mortality that fascinates us most of all. Be that in crime, horror, or mystery, a lot of what a story can hinge on is what would you be willing to do? They want you to position yourself in that narrative because obviously it connects you and pulls you through the story then. Ethics and morality often are going to come into any narrative, but when pure survival is on the line, even more so. Plus, in apocalypse scenarios, you also then get to explore how should a society be structured? Who is going to decide that? What do you do about those who might disagree? And it's this age-old human issue of, well, if somebody else's idea is so clearly flawed, why do you fear that being spoken aloud? If a system by which to live can only exist if all others are extinguished, is it then really so strong in the first place? I think the key difference in most apocalypse content that I wanted to speak to today is how the application of differing ideas or paths are addressed in these end-of-the-world scenarios. Do they stick to the tired, barely plausible one of anybody who disagrees is just automatically our enemy, or the more believable one shown in Survivors, where we see this acceptance that we could fight and create a difficult situation, but we also understand that really isn't optimal for anybody. So instead, how about we just don't do that? More sensationalist scenarios see people of real worth just being disposed of left and right, which is absolutely insane. And when, as I've said, people are really your most vital commodity in an apocalypse, either through their knowledge, but even just their manpower, their ability to do everyday chores and tasks. Now, it would be very easy to just think, well, Luton, I hear you, but all that talking stuff is just boring. You're thinking too hard. These kind of stories are not about that. It's about smashing heads, irons on faces. Okay, sure. Because while that might be the first thing you think of when it comes to apocalypse situations, I would remind that they have to put in those kind of dramatic scenes to make it interesting. Because the real story and interest should be the more practical situations that don't see people being brutally put through some sort of torture Russian roulette gore sim just to demonstrate who's in command. And often in these kind of narratives, you will find characters who actually get themselves in a pretty good position where in reality, that probably would just be where they stay. They find a good location, they have it set up pretty well, and then probably that would be fine. But it's a TV show, so something has to happen, so then a character goes rogue or they get attacked or whatever, and that's just what keeps it moving on. In Survivors, they don't really do that. They just kind of go from one practical situation to another, which is a bit more realistic. And were that show made today, we'd almost certainly have characters trying to kill each other off or some ongoing battle with another group which became like this arc over the whole series. Maybe even one emerges that has got this psycho leader who demonstrates power through violence, exerts control over others through fear. I can literally see it now because it's such an exhausted, tedious trope. And of course, there's always the genuine possibility for such a figure to exist. It's not as if history isn't littered with crazy leaders, but I think in actuality, were that person to exist in an apocalypse scenario of highly diminished population numbers, I think there is a higher chance that somebody would quickly give them one to the back of the head at an opportune moment. The actions of a mad person are going to resonate a lot more strongly, and I think you would see a stronger reaction from the people who are having to deal with that every day. Personally also, I find such characters to really diminish the entire purpose of apocalyptic drama, because there always exists that bigger threat, the existential one that no matter how much you fight and squabble amongst yourselves, it never goes away, it's always there. A plague can still be present and create other problems, as would a zombie apocalypse or a nuclear war. That's why the original Dawn of the Dead and the Day of the Dead are really good, because they deal with that idea that, yes, you've kind of solved some of the problems or you're in this situation, but there's this greater thing happening. And yes, humans are a bit irritating, but this other problem is not going away. And to go on an extraordinarily small tangent, that's why Day of the Dead is such a good film. It's brutal, it's extremely gore-filled, it's got some hilarious characters.
Is there food? I'm running this monkey farm now, Frankenstein, and I want to know what the fuck you're doing with my time.
But the overarching theme there is that all the humans in the underground bunker go crazy because they haven't got a solution. It's not just that they dislike each other, it's that there isn't a solution and they don't know what to do, and it makes them go crazy. They basically get kind of a cabin fever where they just realize that there isn't anything they can do, and the overwhelming existential nightmare which exists outside basically consumes them. And I think that's what Romero tries to illustrate with the zombies, because his zombies obviously are these very slow moving, they don't have a lot of power behind them, but it's just this issue. It doesn't go away, they're still there. The only scenario for me where truly horrific figures could, and more likely, more plausibly emerge, would be when all hope of human salvation is lost. And again, actually, in something like Day of the Dead, that would be plausible too. But my example, of course, would be the apocalypse scene in The Road, because whilst not specified as to what has happened, there's that sense that the disaster is so total, there's little point in surviving beyond existing generations. And while this makes the ending all the more tragic, it does help to rationalise the more extreme behaviour seen among other surviving humans, because they've basically just gone insane. But I would argue that those kind of figures need not be present in other fictional scenarios, because unless the situation is literally life or death, then most of the time finding a best solution for all is going to be preferable, which is what you see in Survivors. The Road and Survivors couldn't be more different, where The Road has seen massive population loss, but they're still facing this environmental catastrophe which will not go away, so everything is kind of destroyed already. Whereas in Survivors, you've lost a massive amount of humans on the planet, but otherwise things are basically as they were, so you can kind of just reconstruct things. I'll finish by saying that once you get past this grounded point of survival, then that is the point at which I believe you could see then different settlements starting to have some friction, potentially even going into open conflict, as is human nature over innumerable scenarios. The issue is that most of the time in these fictions, you don't really get to that point, because I think that's something that you would deal with far down the line. It's not to say you're not going to have scuffles here and there, that's going to happen, and that does happen. I'm talking more generations down the line, because the base issues of immediate survival needs to be addressed. And often in apocalyptic scenarios, they are not. Or if they are, it's not particularly explained or expanded upon just what happened. The how of people seemingly living ordinary-ish lives is often conveniently out of sight because they just want to focus on the other stuff. Which for me is absolutely infuriating, and it is absolutely typical as well, because that is the detail, the timeline of how you survive. That's the fascinating aspect here, and that's what I want to know more about, and that's why I really enjoy Survivors. Because as I noted earlier, those who exist in the immediate aftermath often have these pointed issues of immediate survival. They don't really need to worry too much about what is happening down the line, because all they really need to be concerned about is, can we create a situation with the people we have that will then enable our and our children's generational survival. And like I said, that can be as far as stockpiling knowledge, going and finding it in different places, creating an archive, creating a community. Because when we're looking at a timeline of generations and asking, could your society survive into the future, had they not bothered to begin learning again? Or as Survivors illustrates, that you have so few people in your colony that your primary needs, such as food, shelter, and so on, occupy the majority of your time, so you really can't do anything else, even if you had the hope of educating yourself. It just becomes this futile effort because it's very difficult to commit to somebody spending their time learning when, in the short term, that is essentially irrelevant, unless you're able to think in this long term. So it's this very interesting problematic concept when we begin thinking about massive population loss events and what the world would look like afterwards. It's very doubtful humanity would be able to recover and may instead end up trying to forge some kind of strange make-do-and-mend society, not unlike 40k, that remains somewhat capable but also profoundly ignorant. And that also is seen in other things like Threads. In the fullness of time, that immense loss of knowledge would eventually present itself, and that's why I think these grounded scenarios are so much more appealing and interesting, because yes, in the immediate aftermath, you're basically going to see regular people trying to cope with the understanding they have, but as you go forward with each generation, that's going to become diminished, they're going to struggle, there's going to be technology which is just discarded, or people really have no concept of what it is or that it even exists at all. In the fullness of time, that immense loss of knowledge would eventually present itself as a total disintegration into a society which slots somewhere in between the Iron Age and classical antiquity. And I think that's being pretty generous as well. With 1975 Survivors being basically an apocalyptic soap opera thought experiment with minimal conflict and a focus upon the more plausible ramifications of an apocalypse, it is my perfect apocalypse fictional scenario. I only wish they'd done more and spent time to dig deeper into the questions that we would like to know. Longer term survival, building new structures, maybe developing their own culture, more reliable trade with others. They never attempted anything like a local market between communities, for example, or a travelling caravan, some kind of collective board who could begin seeing the merger of communities into smaller villages and so on. There was a lot of potential and sadly it never quite got there. I think you can understand why because of the time period and the budget, but nonetheless, in my fanciful dreams, if I ever had the time, perhaps I would create some kind of apocalyptic fiction myself that did attempt to focus in on these ideas with more grounded, plausible characters and scenarios that I've talked about. I'd never say never, but given my pretty full plate with things already, plus my own fiction I'm working on, that does seem like something for the back burner, sadly, but nonetheless, let me know your thoughts. If people are really passionate about that, maybe I could try and do it in some small way, I don't know. But for all those who have survived to the end of this video, thank you very much, and if you can give a like, comment below, maybe even a recommend to others, I appreciate it greatly. I'm unsure specifically what to cover in this series next, however I know that they did announce a new iteration of Threads on the horizon as I've mentioned earlier, so perhaps nuclear war could be something to focus in on, perhaps in the timescale we're at the moment. I actually already did some research about that last year also, or if people are really captivated by Survivors, I could try and do a deeper dive into, say, Series 1, an episodic journey through that series, breaking it down, the characters, what I like, dislike about each episode, an episodic review basically, or just something else entirely. Tell me down below what you think the focus in my next video should be in considering other apocalyptic scenarios and how we can understand what such situations mean for humanity. Until then, I'll see you all in the next one.